Okay, so in the previous videos, we've set things up so that we have a Docker file which has given us a basic image that has Tomcat running, but it's just Tomcat with the default applications that have been shipped. We need our own WAR file to be deployed to this Tomcat image. So let's make some steps towards getting that working. And really the first thing we need to do is we need to get rid of this Tomcat welcome page, really. Of course, this is just supplied by Tomcat as a hello world, really. It is an application, it's implemented as a WAR file, and we've got to work out how to get rid of it. I'll just stop the container I was running previously. Now, I know many of you will already be familiar with Tomcat, but just in case, I'll be a little bit explicit here. I'll go back to my running of the container, but this time I'm going to run it in detached mode with -d instead of -it. So of course that's now running in the background, and I can check the logs for it with docker container logs. My container ID begins 48, and yeah, the logs are there. It looks like it's up and running just fine. Now the reason I've done that is I just want to have a little bit of a play around inside the container. We've done this a few times on the course so far. I want to stress that this kind of thing is just what you do when you're developing, you're getting your container up and running, and I'm unsure of the structure of this container, so I'd like to look inside it. You'll remember that we have the docker container exec command, and by using the -it parameter, and then the ID of my container, which I've remembered is began 48. You might need to do a docker container ls to remind yourself of your ID. And then the command that we want to run. Now this will commonly be the command bash, which should get you into a bash shell on that container. Now as you can see, it's working for me, but the reason I was a little bit hesitant there is, just going back to Docker Hub and the tags list, if you choose a slim or an alpine image, then you might find that bash is not available. I think it is actually for the Tomcat slims, but definitely if you're using an alpine image for something else, you might well find that bash simply isn't available, because remember, the slimmer images like alpine often don't have sophisticated tools installed, and bash, believe it or not, is considered a sophisticated tool. So if I exit out of that, if you get an error when you try to exec in and it says the command bash cannot be found, you might have to drop back to the less featureful sh shell, and that is giving me a command line inside that image. So be aware of that, just for if you're using this elsewhere, but we're lucky we can use bash, and I think bash is just easier to work with because it's more feature rich. So I'm inside the container. Now notice by default we have been dropped into this folder USR local Tomcat. Now where did that come from? How did it know that that should be the default folder? Well, again, the answer comes from the Docker file in the base image. Let's find that again. And we mentioned briefly earlier in the course that there is a work dir command in a Docker file, and that just sets a default directory, and from there on in, every command that follows works relative to that directory. Well, you can see in the Tomcat image, they've set the work dir to be this variable Catalina home, which is defined here on line 3, and it happens to be USR local Tomcat. So the work dir has actually been inherited for free by our Docker file. So that's where that came from. Now the reason I've exec'd into this container is I want to look at what's inside it. So if I do an ls, I can see, again, I'm working with some Tomcat knowledge here. There is a folder called webapps, and this is the folder going into webapps. If I look in there, this is where we install whatever websites we want Tomcat to be serving up, and the root folder will contain whatever is being displayed by default. So if I change into the root folder and have a look in there, I reckon the index.jsp file is probably the exact file that has been rendering this default Tomcat page. Now we don't want that, and actually all of this stuff in here, there's a manager application in Tomcat, a host manager, there's some examples, and there's also documentation. Now if we're building a professional website, we don't want any of that to be accessible to the public, and really it's it's rubbish that we don't need. So I'm going to suggest that for our container, we build the container so that these things are simply not present by default. So how can we do that? Well, let's exit that, and I'll stop that container, Docker container stop 48. Okay. Now what we can do in here, and I'll do this before we transfer the WAR file, we can use the run command, which will allow us to issue any Linux commands that we like that are going to run inside the container as the image is being built. So if, for example, I were to create a file on this run command, then that file is going to become part of the file system that we end up with in the ultimate image. So that means I can also do removes as well. I could run the remove command. So I'll rm, and I'm removing a folder. So I think I need to do -rf, and I'm going to remove the folder /usr/local/tomcat/webapps/*. I don't want to remove the webapps folder, but I do want to remove the entire contents of that folder, even if there's directories inside there. I think I could have just done ./webapps because we know the working directory is usr local tomcat. I think I'll leave the full directory in, though it's possibly a little bit clearer. So now we've done that, then we can rebuild the image. Docker image build -t fleetman -webapp, and don't forget the dots. And yeah, we've got that slow step again of it being sent across to the daemon. But assuming the command's correct, check your syntax if you've got any errors there. But you can see that that will have built a layer in this image which will have removed the contents of that folder, and then it's done the other steps building on top of that image. So we should find now, if we repeat the process, Docker container run. Again, I'll run this detached so I can do an exec. I don't need to for this demo, but I'll publish the ports 80 to 8080, and we're running Fleetman web app. So that's running container ID 18. So now we'll exec in container exec -it container ID 18, and the command we're running is bash. So now we're in this new version of the image in user local tomcat. And again, we can cd into web apps, and what we want to see now, if we do an ls, fantastic. We now have a clear web apps directory. And I'm sure now if we go to a browser and refresh that page, yeah, we're now getting a 404. We can see Tomcat is running. We have a 404 now because there's nothing installed on this Tomcat. The next job in the next video is going to be to get our application uploaded to this Tomcat, and that's going to be a pretty simple step. Before I stop this video though, I just want to warn you that I have re-recorded this video and the previous video purely because of the fact that the Alpine images are no longer listed on the Docker Hub page, and I've had a few people who got confused by that. The Alpine images actually still work, but people found it confusing. So even though the old version still works, I've just re-recorded this video using a more up-to-date version of that image. Now, I'm not going to bother re-recording the forthcoming videos because everything works the same, but you will notice line 1 on the upcoming videos will be slightly different simply because I've used an older image. You can ignore that. As long as you're using a reasonably up-to-date Tomcat image, then everything should be working.